One more guest here on our Wednesday edition of the show. That is Mr. Wes Reynolds at Wes Reynolds and the number 1 on Twitter. Wes, how's it going today, man?
Hey, Adam. Good to be with you. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. Plenty of stuff to talk about here today. We're going to talk NFL and NBA with Wes. I know we touched on some NBA stuff last week. We'll kind of try to build off of that a little bit here this week, but we'll start with the Thursday night football game. Game 301, 302 on the board. Kansas City, 3-point road favorite against Oakland. This is a really difficult handicap for me. You've got the short week angle, which always makes it difficult, but Kansas City, they finally got exposed a little bit last week against Pittsburgh. We were sort of looking for that loss to happen. The Steelers were the number 1 consensus team in the traditional Super Contest and the Super Contest Gold. I think 52% of the Gold field took the Steelers last week against the Chiefs. So how do you interpret that here as we go forward into Week 7?
Yeah, this is a difficult one, I think, on the side. I was one of those that was on Pittsburgh last week after that awful performance against Jacksonville, and then Kansas City, of course, off 2 straight primetime wins, one on Monday night, one on Sunday night. Kansas City was about as priced as high as they could be in that spot, being 5-0 at the time and off 2 primetime wins. So I thought there was value in Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh, I think, Kansas City made it competitive late, but I thought, Pittsburgh kind of had their way with them. And I still think Kansas City's a really solid defense, but, they're a defense that I think really is at their best when they're forcing turnovers. They're not a team that's going to get you 3 and out a lot, all the time. I mean, you can move the ball on them. You saw, the Redskins kind of did that in their game, and then, Houston was able to move the ball on them. But with turnovers, that makes them pretty lethal because they're usually pretty efficient offensively. But if I was to look at this game, I would probably look a little bit more at the total and would lean toward the early move on the under. I think that that's the right move, and I think you could still get 47 out there because, I'm a little concerned with Oakland because Derek Carr, if you watch the game with the Chargers this past Sunday, Derek Carr looks like he was a guy throwing with a bad back, which is what he has. And, I don't think he's near 100%. And, the offense really struggled against the Charger team that, hasn't exactly been killing it on defense this year. And the Raiders just really looked out of sync pretty much most of the game on offense. So, I would maybe look at the under here. I know primetime games, the tendency is to go over, but I think probably you maybe the best bet if you're making a bet on this game is to look maybe at the first half under, because some of these primetime games that eventually go over, they end up maybe starting a little bit slow and then kind of pick up as the game goes on. So that would be my look in this one.
For a lot of different reasons. I mean, this is a tough game to figure out. Kansas City's running game finally got stopped. Kareem Hunt had a very poor game here, and of course, this is a guy that was on track to break some rushing records prior to that game against Pittsburgh. So he's in a bit of a bounce-back spot after struggling for the first time this year. You've got Alex Smith, who's a very efficient quarterback. Kansas City leads the league in completion percentage by 2.6% with Alex Smith at the helm over the New York Jets, which is pretty interesting in and of itself, against an Oakland defense that has the 4th highest completion percentage against. Kansas City doesn't turn the football over. Oakland's offense doesn't look good. They're lacking explosive plays. Like you said, Derek Carr looks like a guy that's hurt. But then you've got this travel spot. You've got Kansas City going all the way out to the West Coast to play in the Bay Area on a short week, coming off their first loss. Defensively, they've got some older linebackers that may not be able to recover as quickly. They're still without Eric Berry, which has hurt them in terms of stopping the run and in terms of stopping the middle of the field. So, I mean, I know everybody wants to have action on a Thursday night game, and I totally get it with standalone games. But, man, if you're going to stay off of a primetime game, this may be the one.
Yeah, I think so, too. It is very hard. I mean, looking at, and some of these numbers are unreliable, but looking, early in the week, I mean, you would assume that a lot of the bets are on Kansas City, but the line really hasn't moved very much. And, I mean, there are some guys like me that sometimes can be suckers for home dogs, in primetime games, but this is one on the side for sure I'm more than likely to stay away from.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move on over to Sunday here, and let's talk about game 465, 466 on the board, New Orleans and Green Bay. And this may be the most fascinating game of the weekend, not because of the two teams involved, but because of the situation with the line. So at the Westgate Superbook, the look-ahead line for this game was Green Bay minus 6.5. Aaron Rodgers gets hurt. Line swings to New Orleans minus 3.5. Obviously, that's an incredibly significant move. It's a 10-point line move on Aaron Rodgers. But the number didn't stop there. It's up to 5.5 now with Bovada at 6 on the Saints. I can't remember ever seeing anything like this.
Yeah, and I think, you're talking about a guy that probably has the most value to his team in the league, but I think some of this move could be, guys just maybe trying to get out ahead of the market a little bit, anticipating a line move on the Saints, which has obviously come. But I think looking at this, Brett Hundley, when he came in, was fairly ineffective last week, but he wasn't, he was kind of just thrown into the mix there. I mean, he was, not prepared to be the starter. I mean, when you're a backup, you always got to be prepared. But this week, I think he, is obviously going to take pretty much all the reps with the first team. And it's a totally different spot when you're the starter against, when you're thrown in, when your franchise quarterback gets hurt. So, I think maybe if this keeps going up, there gets to be more value on Green Bay here. And, when you have a team like New Orleans, even though a lot of it, I think they ended up scoring like 3 defensive touchdowns and that forced 5 turnovers. And that inflates the score because people see a team that scores 52 points. So they immediately, their stock is about as high as it can be when you're off putting up that many points in an NFL game. So, Green Bay would be the way I would go here. It'd be Green Bay or nothing for me because, I think that the line has moved up enough. I think with Rodgers being out, it is way priced into the line right now. So, taking 6 with Green Bay, I don't know how much if it gets to 7. I don't anticipate that it will. I think there'd be a lot of money the other way if that were to happen. So I think it's probably kind of settled in this range right now.
Yeah, looking at a New Orleans side is very, very difficult to do. All of the line value has been completely extracted from this game. And to be completely honest with you, a lot of it was extracted with the 10-point adjustment on its own. Is Aaron Rodgers worth 10 points to the line? I don't know. My personal thought would be somewhere around 7.5 or 8. But another element to this line moving around is that Green Bay may be down 3 starting linemen on the offense, or 3 starting offensive linemen, Bakhtiari, Balaga, and Taylor, all leaving last week's game hurt. And then they have some secondary problems as well with a few of those guys leaving the game hurt last week as well. So I think what you kind of had here was a snowball effect and people piling on, not just to Rodgers, but also Green Bay possibly being down 3 linemen when they're going to need to run the football more with Hundley and then also protect Hundley more because while he's mobile, that dude can't throw on the run like Aaron Rodgers. Nobody can throw on the run like Aaron Rodgers. So I think we kind of got that sort of snowball effect too. The question then becomes, at what point do you get value back on Green Bay if they're missing Rodgers plus 3 starting linemen?
Yeah, and to be fair, Green Bay has not had their full offensive line pretty much all year. You saw a little bit even with Rodgers in some of the games. In the Atlanta game on Sunday night a few weeks ago, that really was very evident that they struggled a little bit with missing a couple linemen and guys kind of being banged up from the get-go to start the season. Everything kind of has added up to this line move, but I don't think if you're wanting to bet New Orleans, you might be a little bit late to the party. But I think with Green Bay, I don't know if you're going to get any more points on this, but like I was saying earlier, I think it would be Green Bay or nothing.
All right, so here's another really interesting game here. Game 469, 470 on the board. Dallas takes on San Francisco. The Cowboys, 6-point favorite here. They're coming out of the bye. We saw all the teams that were coming off the bye get pumped up a little bit last week, including some into double-digit favorites. And obviously we know that double-digit favorites did not have a good week at all last week. This isn't a double-digit number. This San Francisco team, first home game back now after playing 3 straight road games. Their last 5 games, lost by 3, by 2, by 3, by 3, by 2. Played a couple of overtime games in the mix as well. The situational handicapper in me looks at this game and says, okay, San Francisco cannot possibly keep this going where they lose close, given the schedule that they've played so far. But, you got to give this team credit. They're playing close games. Kyle Shanahan's doing a hell of a job. What do you think about this game, Wes?
Well, I look at the other team that is 0-6, being the Cleveland Browns, and I think San Francisco is very much better than Cleveland, and I think that they probably have played better than the 1-5 team, the Giants, that actually won a game on Sunday night. You wonder how it's going to be. I think C.J. Beathard gave them a boost offensively, being thrown in there last week. It was kind of the reverse of how Hundley looked, but now it is a little bit of a different situation, being that now you're the guy. You're the guy taking the first team reps. It's been clear that you're the starter. This is your job, at least in the interim here. So you have that, but for Dallas, there's some concern with injuries as well on defense. You've got a couple corners that left the game that are questionable with Awuzie and Nolan Carroll, Sean Lee, who I think really, he maybe doesn't have the total, the Pro Bowl pedigree as some of the other guys do, even though he's been. But I kind of consider Sean Lee the quarterback of that defense. And I think him being out, if he's out, he's got a hamstring injury. That's a bigger loss than I think people would anticipate for Dallas. The number is probably right because it's priced in that the Cowboys are off a bye, and the fact that they're 2-3, and I think people are disappointed with how they started. There was a lot of conventional wisdom on the Cowboys where it's like, you know what? They're going to be better this year, but maybe their record isn't going to show it. Well, so far through 5 games, they haven't really been better. I think this line is probably right. The proverbial gun to head would probably take the 49ers here. I do think with the Cowboys, with that number being below 7, you're going to probably see them in a lot of teasers against an 0-6 team. And the fact that I think it's less than 7, maybe indicates that I think the books think that they have, and the odds makers think they have the right line here, and maybe they're not exactly scared off by teaser action because you haven't really seen that teaser protection price in here, where some offshores might throw 7.5 for the 49ers, where you got to lay $1.30 or $1.40 or $1.50, and you'll see that sometimes at like 5 dimes or a couple different shops they'll put those teaser protection prices out there. So that's something you definitely kind of want to look for when you do this going forward in the NFL.
Well, it looks like Ezekiel Elliott is going to be able to play here for Dallas this week, and that's interesting because it didn't really affect the line at all. It looked like initially he was going to be out, that his suspension was going to be upheld, and now we've got another legal battle going on with that, with the appeal of Elliott's suspension again. So I think that's kind of telling as well, in that this is a guy that has had a lot of success for Dallas, and Dallas's offensive line hasn't been as good, but Elliott's better than Alfred Morris or Darren McFadden or whoever else they would have thrown out there. So the fact that this number didn't really adjust to Elliott, that kind of makes me intrigued as to where we see the late move come in here.
Yeah, me as well, Adam, because I think, the strength of the Dallas team, I think, has a long time, going back several years, really been their offensive line, and that offensive line has not played well this year. They were, I think, and we've talked about this in past podcasts about, that the offensive line play across the league is down the board for various reasons, maybe not being able to have as much live contact through the collective bargaining agreement, the fact that a lot of these linemen and a lot of these college programs are running these spread offenses, and the reads and the protections are way different, and plus the fact that you're playing against faster guys off the edge in the NFL than you're playing against in college. And I mean, these guys can get there. Some of these guys are 270 pounds that are running 4.6 40s as defensive ends or outside linebackers in a 3-4, can get to the quarterback real quick. So you're seeing that, and I mean, then you look at Dallas had been one of the few reliable offensive lines, I think, throughout the league, but they have not played up to snuff this year. Now, is it, is it like a team where maybe they have a couple bad performances and they've been under expectations where they're kind of due to run somebody out? If you recall, like the Seattle game against the Colts on Sunday Night Football a couple weeks ago, where Seattle had been kind of meh, and they were predicted to be a Super Bowl contender, and then all of a sudden they just run out somebody like the Colts and then get a road win the next week in the division. So is that the case like with the Dallas offensive line, where it's like, okay, they haven't performed well, are they sitting on a good one here, or are there some real long-term problems?
I'll tell you what, even if you don't have any interest in this game, one spot that is very clearly circled for me in highlighter and bright-colored Sharpie, whatever you want to call it, San Francisco, after hosting Dallas this week, goes out and plays yet another early kickoff against the Philadelphia Eagles in Week 8. So best-case scenario for us in the betting market is that San Francisco finds a way to win this game as a 6.5, 7-point dog, wherever this number winds up going, and then they go on the road to Philadelphia next week in an even worse spot than what they've been in here recently.
Yeah, exactly. And then plus you've got a Philadelphia team that's in their own kind of tough spot, playing against off the bye, playing on Monday Night Football against Washington this week, who they already beat in Week 1 of the regular season at their place. Washington also coming off the bye. You're going to wonder or wait Philadelphia not coming off the bye, but coming off extra time playing the Thursday night game against Carolina, but Washington coming off the bye. So you got to think that Washington is going to be focused here, and I don't like to use the term revenge spot, but it kind of is, and it's not too far after they played. I mean, we're in Week 7, and these teams played in Week 1, so it's not like it's Week 16, where a lot of things have changed. There's less change, I think, in just having a few weeks span there. So, Philadelphia is in their own tough spot. If they found a way to lose and San Francisco finds a way to win, then that's going to give you some value on Philadelphia because these adjust so much week to week. So,
all right, let's go over to the NBA side of things here, and I want to use this Wednesday card to find some examples here of your thought process for the NBA and some of the things that you're looking for. Let's start with the first game on the board here, 7:01, 7:02. The Brooklyn Nets take on the Indiana Pacers. Pacers, 3-point favorite in this one at home. But these are two teams that really aren't expected to go anywhere this season. Indiana, of course, lost a lot with Paul George moving on, and Brooklyn just hasn't been good for a long time. So, a lot of times you think about teams coming into a season and everyone's optimistic, and, you're never actually out of the playoffs in Game 1 unless you play in the NBA, in which case you're out of the playoffs in Game 1. So what do you think about a matchup like this here? How do you look to break this one down with two teams that, just don't really have a whole lot going for them?
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the tougher games for me, and I mean, these are two teams that I don't think maybe are going to make the playoffs. I do think that there's going to be value I'm not sure this game is the best example, but I think there'll be some value early on some teams that maybe lost some stars. And I could bring one up a little bit later. Clearly the Pacers have lost Paul George, but I do think that they're going to be a little bit better in their win total, and I did play it over 31.5 because I think these guys might have a chip on their shoulder a little bit. You got some young talent here now. Miles Turner kind of emerges as the featured player, and you got some guys that were, traded from their team, and they're going to, maybe look at this as an opportunity to prove their mettle, Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis. This is a little tough because I think Brooklyn is not going to be great, but I don't know if they're going to be a total drag like maybe the Bulls are going to be. I think they're probably going to be the worst team in the Eastern Conference, and perhaps even the Knicks. I think the thing about Brooklyn is I think that they will play hard, and you do have some guys there, I think, with something to prove, like D'Angelo Russell especially, and I think he'll be a more featured player, and I would expect his numbers to take a big jump here. This is a tough one for me, I think, for the first game here, because these are two teams that if they were maybe playing other teams, I'd probably want to take them, but they're kind of playing each other in this spot, so it's likely to be a pass for me.
All right, well, let's look specifically here from the Brooklyn side, and this is something we can carry over to the Indiana side as well with new guys like Oladipo, Collison, Bogdanovich, stuff like that. But for Brooklyn here, you have a lot of new personnel, and this is something I talked about a little bit on yesterday's show in terms of taking it easy, monitoring your exposure a little bit when you've got so much roster turnover, so many player personnel changes. So for Brooklyn, you've got D'Angelo Russell, a guy that wants the ball, like you said, a guy with something to prove. Timofey Mozgov is going to play a much bigger role here for the Nets than he has for the other teams he's recently played for. DeMarre Carroll. DeMarre Carroll's a guy that's played on winning teams pretty much throughout his career. Now he's not on a winning team. So you kind of wonder about his mindset coming into the season. So if you have a lot of turnover here, and these are two teams that have experienced a lot of turnover, typically how long do you sort of give them to get this thing squared away, develop some chemistry, and gel a little bit?
Yeah, I think usually that's going to take several games. Now, the Pacers actually in a lot of spots didn't look too bad in the preseason. I actually played them a couple times. I think where you'll see it show the most in terms of not gelling, maybe defensively. And if you look at where I think this early number has moved, it has moved to the over. So, I think it's a little bit tougher to get in sync defensively to see what they want to do and really establish an identity. And there's a lot of guys in the NBA that can score. Even players on bad teams, and bad teams can score points. So that's where I think it's going to be the struggle early. Maybe is more defensively than it is offensively. You're probably going to see some turnovers that lead to easy baskets. I think that's the thought process on the move towards the over here, at least early.
All right, now here's a game that's really interesting to me here tonight. Game 707, 708. Charlotte takes on Detroit. And, of course, you've got the Detroit Pistons playing in a new venue at Little Caesars Arena. Used to play, of course, at the Palace of Auburn Hills. So we'll see what kind of totals impact that has for the Pistons as we go forward. But, Wes, these are two teams that, had some hopes for last season, expected to be in the playoff picture, and then really weren't. And so you've got two very motivated rosters here, two rosters that have mostly stayed the same. I mean, the Hornets picked up Dwight Howard, the Pistons picked up Tobias Harris. But overall, you still have a lot of the same personnel here with these two squads. So how do you break that down coming into a season where they're pretty much known commodities at this point, but both teams should be very motivated to get off to a good start and hope to erase last year's bad memories?
Yeah, and you usually see kind of early on that there's some value on teams that maybe didn't make the playoffs last year, and especially if you have rosters coming back where you want to, they want to really get off to a good start. unfortunately, in this spot, they're playing each other. Now, the main injury for Charlotte, of course, is Batum being out 6 to 8 weeks with the elbow. Kit Gilchrist also not playing tonight. But, for this particular game, if I was to look at anything, it'd probably be the under, because I think you're going to see these two teams that, didn't make the playoffs last year want to get off to a good start. So I would expect that they would maybe play a little bit better defense in the first game than normal. And, people, I think, maybe getting a little bit concerned about some of the rule changes this year, some of the points of emphasis. They're not going to go for that. The officials aren't going to go for that. Okay, there's a foul, and then guy just throws a 3 up or something, where it's obvious he's trying to get continuation. So I think they're trying to eliminate that a little bit this year. It'll be interesting to see how that's called. But for this particular game, with two motivated teams at least, and I don't think either of these two teams are really that great, but, having missed the playoffs last year, that they're going to want to come focus and maybe bring it a little bit more on the defensive end.
Well, and the Pistons, of course, picking up Avery Bradley, who's a pretty good defensive player there, a longtime fixture with the Boston Celtics. That, it should help that team quite a bit early on in the season here as well. All right, so one of the really obvious situations to look at in the NBA, we got a couple of them here tonight, Milwaukee and Boston, and then Houston and Sacramento. So for Milwaukee and Boston, we see an adjustment to the Gordon Hayward injury, and, everyone saw it. It is burned in everyone's memory forever. It was absolutely brutal. But we've seen that number go down from 5.5 to 3. I don't know how much of that is the back-to-back and the situational angle, how much of that is the adjustment to the line without Gordon Hayward. But what about Houston and Sacramento here? So you got a Houston team, lots of moving parts for them. They add Chris Paul in the Mike D'Antoni system, come from behind to beat Golden State last night. Now they play Sacramento, a team that's not going to be very good, should be very high up in the lottery discussion here this year. Rockets being asked to cover 7.5 points. And this is a spot where it gets a little bit more run because it's the opening game for Sacramento, the second game for Houston. But these are spots that our listeners will face a lot this year. So, Wes, break it down for us. What are you looking at in back-to-backs? What sorts of angles do you like to play?
Yeah, I did. In disclosure, I did play Sacramento here at 8. Just, basically a spot play. Sacramento is kind of an interesting team because they have some young talent, and I do think De'Aaron Fox is going to be a good pick or right in the mix for Rookie of the Year. I took him at 12 to 1. You have De'Aaron Fox, you have Buddy Hield, a couple other young players, Scalavissiere, and those guys. So you have a young core of picks, Harry Giles as well. But they added a lot of veterans. They added George Hill. They added Zach Randolph. They added Vince Carter. And you're going to want to see how, I think, at least long-term for the season, if these guys are motivated or if it's just a paycheck, because these are guys that have been on playoff teams. But I think early on, at least in the season where everybody starts 0-0, the motivation is going to be there more now than it might be in March when you're 12 games under 500 and you're probably going nowhere. So I think you might see the veterans with something to prove here, and I just think that spot with Houston, beating the defending champs on opening night and having to come back to do so, because Golden State was really cooking early, and having to really close the gap where they made it a game, and then eventually were able to get the win. Now, usually sometimes in a back-to-back, that carries over more in the first half, because I think momentum sometimes carries for a team in back-to-back for the first half. I mean, the legs, I don't think, show up, if anything, until the second half. So, you keep in mind, if you're taking Sacramento, you might be down, 10 at the half, but that doesn't necessarily mean your bet is totally cooked here because, sometimes that momentum will carry over to the first half the next night, and then, it'll show up late, and then the other team, continues to fight, and they don't go away, and then that's when you have a ball game.
Now, I don't have any stats to back this up. It's something I was kind of thinking about a little bit as you were talking there. I think a lot of times about situational spots being a bigger deal when you're deep into the season, the dog days of winter prior to the All-Star break, stuff like that, where motivation can be a factor and legs may be a bit of a factor as well. But something I just started thinking about here, you've got Houston on a back-to-back out west right away to start the year. You're still trying to get into that rhythm of the season. You're still trying to get back into that NBA lifestyle of, flying around everywhere, staying in a different bed or sleeping in a different bed every night, different hotel, whatever else guys do on the road. And we don't need to get into that at all here, at least not on today's show. But, I kind of wonder if maybe these situational back-to-backs are a little bit worse early on in the year because a lot of people are going to think, okay, they're going to have their legs, they're perfectly fresh. It's only game 2. But also, there's that adjustment period to getting back into, your lifestyle for the next 6 months. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's right, Adam. And I mean, I think when you look and then looking at different, courts and whatnot, you incorporate that. And in terms of what the scheduling spot is, they spread out the season to lessen the back-to-backs, but there's still going to be plenty of them. I mean, the season's only really starting 2 weeks earlier. It's not like it's starting a full month earlier. But, thinking about, like, some of these home courts, our mutual friend Sports Cheetah actually put out a piece that I retweeted about some of the home court advantages in the NBA because, I mean, there's always the default home field, home court advantage is 3 points, but some are more and some are less. And, I mean, you look at some of the travel spots, especially I believe his 2 top home court advantages, and it makes perfect sense, are the 2 altitude teams, Utah and Denver, because you're playing at altitude there. So that takes something to get used to. Plus, one thing I thought about is that, those cities are kind of close to Vegas, especially if you're on a road trip and you got a day or 2 off in between. Guys are probably, let's say they play in Sacramento or they play in Portland on a Tuesday night, and then they don't have a game till Friday night in Denver or Utah. Well, that's probably going to give them a day in Vegas, where they're getting a day off and having some fun, and then all of a sudden you got to go play one of these altitude teams on the road on a Friday night, and those aren't necessarily the best scheduling spots. So, I mean, that's what I think you're looking at. I think once you get about a month or so in the season, or you've played 10 to 12 games, you really get used to it again. And then, the early and the late in the season, and depending on how much mileage some of these guys have on them and what the motivations are in March, like I was talking about, if you're 12 games under 500, what's really the motivation, or whether, you're really fighting like mad to get into a playoff spot or to win a division or something of that nature.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. And also, too, another attribute to the home court advantage for Denver and Utah is that a lot of teams will hit both of those cities in one trip or in a couple of days. And, playing back-to-back in altitude or 2 out of 3 in altitude, something like that, that can be really difficult for them as well. Let's touch on this here real quickly, Wes. No Kawhi Leonard for San Antonio tonight. No C.J. McCollum for Portland. This is always a big-time point of emphasis in the NBA, is trying to ascertain how much these players are worth. Throw your odds maker hat on for a second here. If Kawhi Leonard's playing for the Spurs tonight, who are a 1.5-point favorite, and this number is going up a little bit in the marketplace right now, they're 1.5-point favorite against the Timberwolves. If Kawhi Leonard's in this game, what's this number?
I would say maybe about 5.5 or 6, because I think Minnesota is priced high because they're one of the teams that have added. They obviously has young talent, and they played below expectations, but with the adding of Jimmy Butler and Gibson, guys that have played for Tom Thibodeau, that there might be some more continuity and better leadership perhaps on the team. But, I think Minnesota was probably priced actually a little bit aggressively in the season wins market. I mean, to be at 48, I fully expect that they're going to be way better than they were last year, but that's about an 18-game difference, 17, 18-game difference. I forget the amount of wins they had last year. I know it was in the low 30s, but that's a big jump for a team. So I think that there's already respect for Minnesota in the betting market, even if it was with Kawhi in the lineup. I don't think it would be 7 or north of that. I think it would be around 5.5 or 6, because I had first looked at that line too, and I was like, wow, only 1.5 over the Timberwolves. This is the Spurs we're talking about, but of course Kawhi being out. But it might not be a game that I might not be chomping at the bit to get involved with when maybe you have a guy that's out to start the season, because you want to see how it plays out. So even though that looks like low-hanging fruit and it's very tempting to take the Spurs only laying a bucket or less at home, that's probably one I want to stay away from and just, kind of see how that situation plays out.
So as we know here, within the flow of an NBA game, things can be very frustrating. Cavs led by 16 at the break yesterday, only won by 3. Golden State led by 13 going into the fourth quarter, lost that game by a point as they got outscored by 14 in the fourth quarter. So, Wes, I know you know where I'm going with this, but it can be very frustrating, very challenging to bet full game sides and totals in the NBA, because if teams have a big lead in the fourth quarter, they'll let a foot off the gas. They have a big lead at halftime. Maybe they come out a little bit complacent in the second half. You do a lot of derivative betting, quarters, halves, second halves, all that type of stuff. Give us some intel here, man. What is it that you're looking for in terms of betting those derivatives?
Well, sometimes, with quarters, especially with if, like, let's say you blow a lead and you've got a lead going into the fourth quarter, and I don't have, advanced data on this, but, you go into the lead, leading the game in the fourth quarter, and you blow a fourth quarter lead at home, then you got to go on the road the next night. Let's say you're, Indiana, and you blow a lead in the fourth quarter, and then you got to go to, Minnesota, or you got to go to Oklahoma City or something, especially like when you're switching a time zone. When you're taking a little bit of it's a little bit less if you're Indiana and you're going to Cleveland the next night. But, sometimes I like to pick on those teams going into the first quarter of that next night, because the frustration is still there, and it's still in your head, and it's a very short turnaround to get that out of your head. So sometimes I like to look at that a little bit in the first quarter. A lot of it too is kind of looking at the market and seeing which books have which prices where, and trying to see if you can pick up some tells. Looking at the screen, it's not going to always give you the answer, though, so you can't really do that blindly. But, looking at that a little bit, looking at maybe, especially if there's good, a lot of maybe sharp sentiment sometimes on the dog for the game, they may not cover the first half. So don't necessarily, immediately jump and bet that in the first half, because it's like, okay, well, the favorite, they covered the first half. So, sometimes it's okay to wait and see if you can take a better number. I was looking at Houston last night, and I regret not playing it now, of course, because it won. We all do that. But, I was looking at that, 9.5, and then that's what the Warriors were up by halftime. I forget what the second half line was, but you probably were able to get north of double digits if you had waited for the second half. So, it's a way to maybe, if you're kind of iffy on a play, and then, that you don't make it, and then maybe you see a spot where they're given a better number, or, sometimes where you have like a first half total, and you have a bunch of points at the end of the first half. And we'll talk about this with college basketball too. You get a bunch of points in that final minute or two in the first half. Well, that's going to get priced in a little bit with that second half number to give you value. And then that's maybe when you take a look at the under under for the second half. So those are little things that I kind of like to look at and monitor and, play around with.
Well, another thing that sounds kind of obvious, but of course we don't want to take anything for granted when it comes to handicapping, is foul trouble. I mean, foul trouble is another big thing here, and especially I would think early on in the season. There was something that you mentioned earlier on in the segment here, points of emphasis. And we see it in the NHL as well, where early on in the year, it seems like just about everything is called. And then as you go throughout the year, officials just kind of let the guys play. They start to, relax some of those points of emphasis a little bit. So you're getting less power plays. Maybe you're getting fewer free throw attempts. So that's something you want to look at early on in the season as well, not just from a side standpoint, but a total standpoint as well. Do teams have some of those fouls to give with the starters? Stuff like that. It's all very important. And I like that you do a lot of derivative stuff, Wes. And I know it's part of your bankroll management and your risk profile to do that because you like to play high volume. You like to play a lot of small edges into bigger edges. But I think that, that's kind of the future of this industry is in looking at derivative betting and, of course, live betting as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you looked at the live betting last night, I mean, I forget what the biggest lead was, but I know the Warriors jumped out really, really early because conventional wisdom and why I kind of stayed away from it is, hey, go against the team in the first half because they're all smiles and they all get in the ring and introduce before the crowd, So conventional wisdom would be like, hey, take the Rockets. They're going to be fired up, man. They're going to be ready to, rip these guys' throats out. And what happens, the Warriors are up by 9. I think the first half line, I'm guessing, was 5. And I think the Warriors were up by 9 in halftime, and they got out to like a real quick 15-point lead in the first quarter. And that's where you look for your live betting. It's like, well, I considered, taking 9.5, but I backed off. But now I'm getting like 15. Maybe it's worth a shot now with the live betting. And I mean, of course, that can go the other way, and a team can get run out by 30. But that's when you're looking to say, okay, I almost was going to take it at this number, but if I'm getting this many more points, now maybe it's worth a shot because the old, kind of saying in the NBA is, most every game, everybody makes a run. Even if a team is way down, they can make a run. So, that's the thing. I think that's probably live betting with the NBA is the most intriguing because there's so many fluctuations in a game. There's so many. It's a 48-minute game. There's 10. There's all kind of double-digit runs, and there's really looking at the rotations and what guys are going to play. I mean, I remember the conventional wisdom, like with the Clippers last year in the live betting, is when Paul goes out in the first quarter when he was with the Clippers at the under 3-minute timeout. That's when you get on the opponent live. And you would see a lot of teams make runs early into the second quarter on that second unit. So it's just kind of watching and observing, looking at the game flow, and, looking to anticipate those runs and trying to pick up on those tendencies and those patterns.
I love that you brought that up about rotations because that's such a significant thing in the NBA. I mean, in college football and the NFL, the starters are the starters, and they're going to play, as much as they possibly can as long as they're not hurt. NHL, you're rotating through the lineup. Sometimes you'll throw your fourth line out there, something like that. And if you're watching the game really, really closely and you can pick up on something like that, sure, maybe you can throw a live bet out there. But it's so much more noticeable in the NBA when they make those substitutions, and that does create some value out there in the live betting market. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Wes, lots of great stuff here on today's show, man. We'll carry over some of these topics as we keep going throughout the NBA season. But thank you so much for joining me, buddy, and I'll talk to you again next week.
Hey, man, thanks for having me as always, buddy.